back on the agenda.
Paul, thank you for that. Joining us now, we've got the Minister for the Environment and Energy, Josh Frydenberg, in Melbourne. Josh Frydenberg, thanks so much for your time. You've said quite definitively, along with the Prime Minister, that the renewable energy levels in South Australia weren't the catalyst for the blackout. However, the question I ask you this morning is there any prospect or any chance that they did exacerbate that cascading effect that we've heard about from the energy regulator, which then caused the blackout in South Australia?
Well, the preliminary advice to me, Kieran, is that's not the case, although, as Paul has just said, there will need to be a full inquiry into what happened, and AEMO, as the energy market operator, already has that work underway, and this will obviously be the subject of further discussions between the Commonwealth and the state and territory energy ministers at the upcoming COAG meeting, which we're planning to hold at the end of this coming week. But clearly, following the events in South Australia, we need to have a real debate about the implications of the higher reliance on renewables, and particularly the intermittent supply of renewables, namely wind and solar, is having on both the stability and the price of electricity. Because when you have a high use of renewables, some 41% in South Australia, it leads to a lack of consistency in the quantity of generation, namely that when the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, electricity's not being generated, and that means there's a higher reliance on interconnectors. And secondly, there's a lack of consistency in the quality of the generation, because the voltage and the frequency that is derived from that intermittent generation is not of the quality that you get from coal or hydro or gas. And that level of frequency does create problems for the stability of the system. So these are very serious issues which we need to work through, because clearly the states have an illusion at the moment about the impact that renewables is having on the system.
Well, Minister, let's get to the nub of this. What can the federal government do? What can the Turnbull government do about this? You've just said that the renewable energy targets of these state Labor governments are compromising energy security and adequate pricing. So what does the national government do in that situation?
Well, you've got the states pursuing these ridiculously high and unrealistic state-based renewable energy targets. So, for example, in Victoria, they have a 40% renewable energy target by 2025, when currently they only have 12% generation. In Queensland, they have a 50% renewable energy target by 2030, when they only have about 4.5% of renewable generation currently. And then the new Territory government, Northern Territory government, wants to have a 50% target as well by 2030. So we really need to get the states and the Commonwealth on the same page when it comes to their state-based targets and the federal target, which for us is 23.5% by 2020, which we're very confident, Paul, we can reach while maintaining energy security.
What do you say, though, to the argument that the states' levels, that their targets are actually commensurate with what's needed to achieve the overall emissions reduction target that the Prime Minister signed up to in Paris?
Well, we're very confident that we will get to our 26 to 28% emissions reduction target on the policies that we are developing, and also that the policies that we have in place. Let's not forget, Kieran, that we beat our first Kyoto target, and that we're on track to beat our 2020 target by 78 million tonnes. And our 26 to 28% target is the second highest in the G20 on a per capita basis. They're very strong targets. But we, through our National Electricity and Energy Productivity Plan, through the work of the Emissions Reduction Fund, through the work of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, through our 23.5% RET, we're on track to do that. And of course, reducing our emissions is vitally important. But for the states, for the Greens, for the Labor Party, they seem to put that ahead of energy security, and we don't. We're unapologetic that keeping the lights on and energy security is our number one responsibility and our number one concern.
You're confident you can do both? You can keep the lights on and achieve those broader targets?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you see, the problem for the Labor Party is not only at the states they've got these unrealistic targets, but Bill Shorten, as a sop to the left of his party, worried about his left flank from the Greens, has adopted this crazy 50% renewable energy target by 2030, but hasn't given us any detail as to how he's going to get there, or that he's actually thought about the impact of that target on price as well as on the stability of the system.
So what do you expect from the Labor Party, given it's got this 50% target by 2030, and it's had this now for some time? Would you expect Labor to produce modelling? Would you expect Labor to outline how it gets to the 50% target, and what are the consequences for both security and price?
Well, what's amazing, Paul, about Labor's target, which was adopted at their 2015 National Conference, is that they went into this last election in their election manifesto saying that they would produce the design details in October 2017. So they expected the Australian people to vote them in this time round without providing any detail about a fundamental issue such as energy policy and electricity pricing. And now they're going to sit in the Parliament and we have to wait till October 2017 to see actually how they're going to get there. And by Mark Butler's own words, Labor's going to need to build 2,000 megawatts of renewable generation each and every year for the next decade. Now that's equivalent to 10,000 wind turbines. Now, Bloomberg Energy Finance has told us that's going to cost at least $48 billion. Now, I don't see that in Labor's budget numbers. Where are these wind farms going to be? Who's going to pay for it? These are the questions that Bill Shorten and Mark Butler need to answer. And I have to tell you, I mean, the CFMEU have even brought Bill Shorten to task here. Tony Marr has sent an open letter to the ACTU saying Labor's 50% renewable energy target is not the most efficient way to reduce emissions and will have real impacts on price.
Now, you're going to be meeting with your
And
ministers, your state counterparts this week in Emergency Energy Council. What do you want to see out of that? Is there any chance that you can secure common ground, particularly with the states of South Australia, Victoria and Queensland, given how critical you've been of their respective targets?
Well, I just want the Labor states to understand that there is a cost and there are implications to these aggressive state-based renewable energy targets. You see, they seem to have adopted these without understanding the impact for energy security. The Australian Energy Market Operator has pointed out as recently as August this year that if the interconnectors between South Australia and Victoria went down, because of the high reliance on intermittent supply, namely wind and solar, there would be, in their words, a high likelihood of a full regional blackout. So that's from the Energy Market Operator as recently as August. And that is the real concern, that South Australia has pursued these targets without necessarily understanding what is the implication for the reliability of their system. Because if you do rely more on these interconnectors and these interconnectors go down and you've got intermittent supply, which means that if the wind's not blowing or the sun's not shining, electricity is not being generated, then this is exactly the problem that we're talking about, together with the lack of frequency and voltage at the 50 hertz that you need. These are the real questions that the states and the Commonwealth need to be answering if we're going to get a proper, functioning, effective, efficient national electricity market.
Well, if we look at Victoria, it's likely that the coal-based Hazelwood plant will close. Victoria has got a very ambitious renewable energy target. What are the consequences from for Victoria of the closure of that plant? What do you expect to see from the Victorian government?
Well, we haven't had a final confirmation about what is going to happen with the future of Hazelwood, but it's worth pointing out that Hazelwood is around 25% of Victoria's electricity supply and about 5% of the national electricity market. Now, it's a brown coal-fired power generator, and it's also Australia's dirtiest coal-fired power generator because it's around 50 years old and it's brown coal. Now, its removal from the system will have an impact on both supply and price. And what the Victorian government needs to do is actually be open with the Victorian people about this. I noticed that the Victorian Energy Minister, through a spokesman, said it wouldn't have an impact on supply. Well, if you take out 25% of the supply into the Victorian market, of course it's going to have an impact on supply. So let's quit the illusion about the implications of some of these decisions and events and actually just come clean with the Australian people about its impact. And they're the issues that we'll have to work through at COAG. They're the issues that we have to work through between the state and the federal government.
Now, you've described the state's targets, some of them as aggressive, the Labor plan as crazy. Let me get your view on renewables as a source of power. Are you still optimistic about their contribution, an increasing contribution to our power grid, and specifically the arguments made by advocates in this space, for example, that the cost of solar, for example, vis-a-vis traditional sources of power is coming down, that battery technology is improving. Do you accept that renewables will increasingly play a more important role in our economy, or have you gone lukewarm on that?
Well, no, Kieran, let's be clear. The Commonwealth has a bipartisan legislated target of 23.5% of renewables by 2020. Now, currently we're at 15% and we've still got some way to go. So the Commonwealth is absolutely committed to that renewable energy target and to the use of renewables in our overall energy mix. But there is a very cautionary note here, which is you've got to do it in a careful and considered way, because energy security is your #1 concern. And that's where we have to have the debate. It's fine to adopt more renewables, and you're right, the costs are coming down quite significantly, but they're still higher. So, for example, to produce a megawatt of power, it's about $100 for wind and solar on average, about $80 for gas, and about $50 for coal, and if it's going to be brown coal, it's going to be less than that. So when you take out some of the coal-fired power generation or the gas-fired power generation, both of which occurred in South Australia, and you fill it with more renewables, then there is going to be an upward pressure on price. And we can't lose sight of the impact that it has on households. If you're a single mum with a few kids and you're at home in winter, you want to keep the lights on, you want to keep the heating on. They're your concerns, the affordability. If you're a big investor in South Australia, whether you're Olympic Dam or Nearstar or at Arium, you've got to think about electricity prices because you're a heavy user of that. And jobs flow from major investment by industrials. So this is where the rubber hits the road, to be honest. This is where Labor has done no thinking. It's just like it's failed carbon tax, it's Citizens Assembly, it's cash for clunkers, it's pink bats. It just rushes headlong into this purely because of the ideological reasons and a grab for the votes from the left, rather than thinking, what is the real implications for energy security and for affordability?
Minister, why didn't we hear this from the Prime Minister in the recent election campaign? There was virtually no discussion in the election campaign about renewables, about energy, about the cost of electricity. Why was the government missing in action on this front?
Well, Paul, we certainly weren't missing in action. We have been consistent in talking about the impact on affordability and reliability.
Minister, this was not an issue
of energy.
I mean, this was not made a frontline election issue by Malcolm Turnbull at the recent election. This week we've got you and Malcolm Turnbull banging on about this relentlessly, telling us it was a big issue. What went wrong in the campaign?
Well, as you know, we fought the last election campaign. You go back to 2010 on the carbon tax, so it's not like these are new issues. The cost of electricity has been one that's been around for some time, and the Australian people's views have been made very clear. But what Malcolm Turnbull has done by talking about energy security is he has brought home the reality of the fallacy of Labor's targets, because he's right to say if you're stuck in an elevator because of a statewide blackout, or the food is thawing in your fridge, or you can't plug your medical equipment into the wall because the electricity is out, well, reducing emissions doesn't count much to to you then. It's pretty cold comfort, to be honest. And so that's why we'll continue to talk about this issue, and I'll push the Labor Party for detail. I mean, it's just not good enough for Mark Butler and for Bill Shorten to say that they will give us the design details on their 50% renewable energy target in October 2017, which is what they said at the election. The Australian people need to know now what are the implications of these irrational decisions.
Now, we had the Prime Minister indicate this week that he wants a uniform nationwide target when it comes to renewables, instead of the mess we have at the moment with different targets by various states and a different target by the national government. How realistic is it to think that we can actually get there, given the deep commitment of the Labor Party and various Labor governments to their own targets?
Well, I'd be saying to those Labor state governments and to the federal opposition, look at what happened in South Australia. Look at the enormous economic consequences that have occurred as a result of that region-wide blackout. Look at what the Australian Energy Market Operator is telling us about the danger of pursuing more renewables without bearing in mind the implications for the frequency control and ancillary services, for the voltage that is required to stabilise the system. And, you know, battery storage is not there yet. It's a fantastic, technology that we're pouring money into its research and development, and hopefully it will be the swing factor in the future. But right now, it can't provide on a commercial scale the storage that you need to make intermittent supply from wind and solar equivalent to what you would get from gas, coal and hydro. That's the reality of it. So I'd say to the Labor Party, don't leave this to the never-never. Deal with this now. Accept that what happened in South Australia was a seismic event that calls for a rethink about energy policy and energy security in this country.
What, if anything, I know we're awaiting an investigation, Minister, but what, if anything, could have been done that wasn't, that would have stopped the blackout this week?
Well, these are the questions, Kieran, we'll be asking of the Australian Energy Market Operator in the post-mortem of this event. I mean, why did the cascading effect occur? Why couldn't it have been contained? Why have we seen Category 5 cyclones in Queensland but not a regional statewide blackout? Why is the transmission equipment not hardened to take into account a 1 in 100 in a year weather event as opposed to a 1 in a 50-year weather event? Was the proper investment put in place for that infrastructure? What more can we do to make the system resilient against these type of shocks? They're the questions that we will be asking in the weeks and months ahead.
That well-known son of South Australia, Senator Nick Xenophon, was out of the blocks very quickly this week, slamming what happened in South Australia, talking about how terrible and irresponsible and unacceptable this was. Yet I noticed that his own policy is for a 50% renewable energy target, a very ambitious target. Do you see any inconsistency there?
Well, I think Nick Xenophon's comments were both disappointing and strange, because here in the teeth of the crisis on that evening on Wednesday, he rushes out to say that the power is gone from Adelaide Hospital and that the power won't be back to 4 o'clock in the morning. And as far as I understand, he was never given any official briefings by the Australian Energy Market Operator or the people in the know. And in fact, as you know, the power did come back much sooner than that, and the power was not out at the hospital. And I've spoken to, my Labor counterpart in South Australia, and they were also quite mystified as to why Nick Xenophon said this. Now, as for his position on renewables, you're absolutely right. He took into the election a 50% renewable energy target, but Nick Xenophon hasn't told the Australian people how he's going to get there as well. So these are the questions Nick Xenophon needs to answer. Where's his 50% renewables going to come from, and what are the impacts are going to be on stability and price in South Australia from his target? So it seemed to me that he was jumping on the soapbox at the most inappropriate of time in order to grab a headline and a political advantage.
Now, you've repeated the message from the government that your current framework of policies is sufficient to reach the trajectory in terms of targets for emission reduction. I want to ask you, though, does direct action need to be adapted into some form of, for example, an intensity-based emissions trading scheme for the power sector? You would get Labor support on that. They support such an initiative. And the argument from those within this space is that it wouldn't take too much to adapt the elements of direct action to an intensity-based ETS for that power sector specifically.
Well, I know that's the position of the Labor Party, that's the position of Nick Xenophon, we've also seen a report from the Climate Change Authority and others that have talked about this. We've got a 2017 review, and obviously that will be important. But when it comes to the Emissions Reduction Fund, we know how successful that has been, Kieran, because the cost of abatement for the 143 million tonnes that have already been proceeded through the various auctions has been $12.10. Now, this is a fraction of the cost per tonne of abatement than you saw from Labor's carbon tax. And we didn't have the punitive implications, the punitive expenses that were incurred as a result of that tax. So it's been very effective, and we've got an auction that's coming up to be run by the Clean Energy Regulator very shortly, which will again be an important opportunity. But the Climate Change Authority even pointed to our Emissions Reduction Fund and the success it has had. So I think that has worked well, despite it being ridiculed by the Labor Party. But as for our future climate change policy, we've got a review in 2017. That will be an appropriate time. Other than saying the fact that the Prime Minister has brought together in this major machinery of government change both energy policy and climate change policy shows how serious we are about the integration and the fusion of these two important policy areas.
Josh Frydenberg, thank you for your time this Sunday. Appreciate it. After the break, Paul and I will be joined by the Shadow Minister, Mark Butler.